Why do we assume 2 Corinthians 6:14 has anything to do with marriage, or marriage specifically even? There's nothing in the immediate context to even suggest it, nor before or after the whole passage, or even within the passage, is Paul discussing marriage or any kind of relationship. So why do we apply this to marriages to non-Christians specifically? Nothing in any of the verses preceding 14 has anything to do with marriage or relationships. It's a weird, jarring transition to suddenly go from explaining or defending your apostleship to don't marry unbelievers, if that's what Paul intended. But the language itself doesn't really necessitate that interpretation. There's no actual mention of marriage itself in 14, or for that matter, any of the surrounding verses. Another thing, too, that's weird in the verse, there's no word in the Greek for with in this sentence. The translation we usually have is really from the Latin nolite iugum ducere cum infidelibus, which literally reads, don't lead the yoke with unbelievers. But the Greek literally says, don't become differently yoked by two or four untrusted or unbelieving people. You'd expect the preposition sun or sin, meaning together with, but it's not there. I checked the Textus Receptus, Byzantine, and critical texts, and it's not present in any of them. It's just the plural substantive in the dative case. That's actually weird. There are 3 different prepositions which could have been used for with, but none of them are present. Now, there are also about 400 years in between the Greek of Paul's writing and the Greek which Jerome would have known when he translated it in the 5th century. That's almost to the point of unintelligibility between different stages of the same language. I do kind of wonder if language evolution had anything to do with how he rendered it. Regardless, interpreting it as meaning don't marry unbelievers doesn't fit the preceding context or anything afterwards. It also somewhat contradicts what he said in 1 Corinthians about not leaving an unbelieving spouse if they're content to stay married to you. If Paul had applied the same reasoning that he does in the rest of the chapter, he would have encouraged them to leave. Something doesn't mesh, at least not with this interpretation. It makes more sense in the context of both of Paul's letters to Corinth that Paul is talking about not being unequally yoked with, as he says in 1 Corinthians 5, anyone named a brother who is immoral, greedy, a slanderer, drunkard, and so on, and not even to eat with such a person. In truth, in all his letters, or in his letters to the Corinthians, this is the only group of people that he is so harsh with, that is, those who call themselves Christians, but, as he describes, whose God is their belly, whose glory is their shame, who set their minds on earthly things. This makes perfect sense when he says, don't be unequally yoked by as the word can be translated, untrusted, untrustworthy, unfaithful. As he writes of those outside of the church, I didn't tell you to keep away from those on the outside of the church. Otherwise, you'd have to leave the world completely. But to not keep company with the one named a brother who is immoral. He goes on to say, those on the outside God will judge, but then says, put away from yourselves the offending person. This interpretation also fits the harsh language he uses in the rest of 6, where he quotes from the Septuagint. Exit out from the middle of them and be excommunicate from them, says the Lord. As I wrote before, Paul did not have marriage or other personal relationships with those on the outside in mind when he wrote these words. Excuse me. But continued communion with those named Christians who do not actually live as Jesus Christ taught or walk as he walked. This should also be illustrated in that in 1 Corinthians 7, believing spouses were not to divorce their unbelieving spouses if they consented to live with and remain married to them. Finally, concluding his line of thought from chapter 6 in 2 Corinthians 7:1, Paul writes, we should cleanse ourselves from every pollution of flesh and spirit, bringing holiness to completion with divine fear. Again, the only group of people with whom Paul uses such harsh language to describe are those who claim to be Christians but live enslaved to their flesh. Paul wasn't forbidding interfaith marriages, friendships, or relationships. He himself counted the Asiarchs, the high priests of the imperial cult, as his friends. He wasn't saying anything about interactions or relationships with non-Christians at all. He was reiterating a point that he makes over and over again, that the Corinthian Christians should have nothing to do with and no communion with those who, as John describes in his first epistle, claim to walk in the light, but walk in darkness instead.